Have you ever had a moment, maybe driving alone, maybe lying awake at 2 a.m., where you suddenly thought, wait, is this even my life? Did I choose any of this, or did I just end up here? If that's ever crossed your mind, I want you to know it's not a crisis. It's not a sign that something's wrong with you. According to Carl Jung, it might actually be the most important question a person can ask themselves. He had a word for the process that question opens the door to. He called it individuation. And today, I want to walk through what it actually means, because once you understand it, you start seeing your entire life a little differently. Hash the self you were born, with V's the self you built. Jung made a distinction that sounds simple, but is actually pretty profound once you sit with it. He believed there's a difference between the self, with a capital S, your true, whole, authentic core, and the ego, the version of you that's been shaped, trained, and adjusted to survive in the world. From the moment you were born, you started absorbing instructions. Be good, don't cry too much. Be smart, but not too proud. Be successful, but don't outshine certain people. Be likable, be agreeable. Don't take up too much space, but also don't disappear completely. None of this was malicious. Most of the people teaching you this were just trying to help you survive in the family, culture, and environment you were born into. But here's the catch. Somewhere along the way, many of us stopped being able to tell the difference between who we actually are and who we learned we needed to be in order to be accepted. That gap between the authentic self and the adapted ego is exactly what individuation is meant to close. Hash why this process doesn't happen automatically. Here's something that might be uncomfortable to hear. Most people never actually go through individuation, not because they're incapable of it, but because the process requires something most of us spend our whole lives avoiding. It requires looking directly at the parts of ourselves we've hidden, denied, or rejected. Jung believed that growing up means constantly trading authenticity for acceptance. And once that trade becomes a habit, it becomes invisible. You stop noticing you're doing it. You just call it being responsible, or being mature, or being realistic. But every time you silence a real feeling because it's inconvenient, every time you choose the safe path because the authentic one feels too exposed, every time you perform a version of confidence you don't actually feel, you're moving further away from your own center. The strange part is, this can go on for years, even decades, without you fully realizing it. Life can look completely fine from the outside. The job is stable. The relationships exist. The schedule is full. But something quiet feels off, like you're watching your own life instead of actually living it. That feeling is often the first sign that individuation is calling. Hash the role of the shadow in becoming whole. You can't talk about individuation without talking about the shadow, because Jung believed they're directly connected. Remember, the shadow holds everything you've pushed down. The anger you weren't allowed to express. The ambition you were told was too much. The needs you learned to silence because they were inconvenient for everyone else. Here's the part that surprises people. Individuation doesn't mean getting rid of the shadow. It means integrating it. Bringing those rejected parts back into the light, not to act them out carelessly, but to actually own them as part of who you are. Think about it this way. A person who has never acknowledged their own anger isn't necessarily peaceful. They're often just disconnected from a part of themselves, and that disconnection tends to leak out in other ways: passive aggression, sudden outbursts that seem disproportionate, or a vague sense of resentment they can't quite explain. But a person who has actually faced their anger, understood where it comes from, and learned to hold it consciously, they're not controlled by it anymore. They've taken something that used to run in the dark and brought it into a place where it can actually be managed, understood, even used constructively. That's integration. That's a piece of individuation in action. Hash the cost of staying comfortable. Let's be honest about something. Individuation isn't comfortable. It often starts with a kind of unraveling. The roles that used to feel solid start to feel hollow. Relationships built on an old version of you start to feel strained. Habits that once felt safe start to feel like a cage instead of a shelter. This is exactly why most people quietly choose to avoid this process altogether. It's not laziness. It's fear, completely reasonable fear, of losing the identity and the relationships built around the old version of yourself. Jung wasn't naive about this. He knew individuation wasn't. A peaceful upgrade. He described it more like a confrontation, a meeting between who you've been pretending to be and who you actually are underneath all of that performance. But here's the part worth holding onto. The discomfort of individuation is temporary. The discomfort of never starting it, the quiet ache of living a life that was never quite yours, that has a way of staying with you far longer. Hash what individuation actually looks like in real life. This isn't some abstract spiritual concept that only applies to monks or therapists. It shows up in incredibly ordinary moments. It looks like finally admitting you don't actually want the career path you've been pursuing, even though you're good at it. It looks like setting a boundary with a family member, even though it disrupts a decades-old pattern of keeping the peace at your own expense. It looks like grieving a version of yourself you have to let go of in order to become someone more honest. It also looks like small, quiet victories. Saying what you actually think in a conversation instead of the version you think people want to hear. Choosing rest because your body needs it, not because you've earned it. Recognizing a pattern you've repeated in every relationship, and finally asking why, instead of blaming the same external circumstances every time. None of these moments are dramatic from the outside, but each one is a small act of choosing the self over the inherited ego. And according to Jung, that's exactly what a meaningful life is built from, one honest choice at a time. Hash individuation is not a destination. One more thing worth saying clearly. Individuation isn't a finish line you cross and then you're done, fully evolved, fully healed, fully yourself forever. Jung described it as a lifelong process, something you keep returning to again and again at every new stage of life. The person you needed to become at 20 is not the same person you need to become at 40 or 60. New layers of conditioning reveal themselves. New shadows emerge. New parts of the self ask to be acknowledged. This isn't a sign of failure. It's just what it means to keep growing instead of freezing in place. So if you feel like you're starting over again in some part of your life, that's not regression. That might just be individuation, doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Hash one thing to carry with you. Before we end today, here's something to sit with. Think about one role you play at work, in your family, in a friendship, that feels more like a performance than a true expression of who you are. You don't have to change anything about it today. Just notice it. Notice the gap between the role and the real feeling underneath it. That noticing alone is the beginning of the entire process Jung spent his life trying to describe. Becoming who you actually are doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens quietly, one honest noticing at a time. I'll see you in the next one.